David Shipley, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, John. It's great to be here.
David, you are a very interesting chap. You've had a storied background, but instead of me bringing a biographical note to bear on this conversation, let's hear it from the horse's mouth himself, not meaning to other you as a non-human. You are an advocate for prison reform, but it's been a long, winding, perhaps unexpected path to that point. I dare say you probably wouldn't have grown up thinking that's what you're going to be doing with your time. Perhaps you can tell us how you found yourself in this position, advocate for prison reform here in the United Kingdom.
Sure. You're right. I've had I think quite a varied life, and I think career has probably put more structure to it than there actually has been. But so I've done lots of things. I've sold forklift trucks. I worked in recruitment. I did some business advising, governmental bodies in sub-Saharan Africa. I worked in corporate finance. I produced a film, Brexit the movie. But one day in 2014, I did something really stupid and dishonest. So I, at the time, was working in corporate finance, and I was talking to a private equity fund about setting up a new firm, about them investing with me to create it. And I lied to them. They asked me what fees I generated historically from clients, and I told them a number that wasn't true. I massively inflated what I had generated from clients. And I in doing that, committed a fraud. And a little bit later in the conversation, when they asked me to prove that these numbers I was quoting were real, I produced a fake schedule of fees and showed that to them. And they invested in the business, and the business went on running it for years. And then in 2018, early 2018, I was contacted by the police because there'd been some due diligence going on around the company, and it's been unearthed. And I gave an interview, and I confessed in the interview. I told them everything I'd done, and it felt like this huge weight lifting off. I think I've been carrying that guilt and that fear of being caught for years, and I don't think I really necessarily knew what would happen from that point on, but it felt good to confess. And then the justice system in this country is incredibly slow. So I was first approached by the police, I think, in January of 2018. I did an interview around Easter time, and then they charged me in the autumn, and it was finally in the spring of 2019 that I got to go into the Crown Court and plead guilty. And then my sentencing took almost another year. So it wasn't until the beginning of February 2020 that I was actually sentenced. And I was sentenced to prison. So I was given a sentence of 45 months, which, as you may know, it doesn't mean you go to prison for 45 months in this country. At the time, it meant I would spend about half of that actually in jail. And I was sent off from Southwark Crown Court in what's called a sweat box, a prison transport van, which you may have seen driving around. You see these white Serco vans with tiny dark windows along the side. That's transporting prisoners. And to sort of contextualize when that was, so I arrived at Wandsworth on the evening of the 6th of February 2020, and I think it was the next day in my diary I wrote that the first Brits were being flown back from China to be brought home to get away from this Chinese coronavirus, as it was being called at the time. So this was still pre-lockdown. Lockdown came at the end of March, I think, didn't it? March 25th, 26th. So I had a couple of months of what I would call normal prison before lockdown happened. And through my prison experience, I was there at Wandsworth for the whole of 2020. I got moved to another jail just before Christmas. And then at the other jail, I was there at the end of my sentence when I was released on tag in August of 2021. But all the time there, I think, before I went to prison, I was terrified. I think you imagine it's going to be a place of violence, perhaps of sexual violence, of drugs, of danger. And it's not, there is violence in prison, but it's not, generally speaking, random. And the drugs are there, but if you don't want to do drugs, you don't want to get involved in violence, it's not really going to come to you. If you don't get into debt, you're not going to have trouble, generally speaking. So that bit wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, but actually so much else about the prison system is appalling. And I was shocked by how bad it was. And I often say it radicalized me. I think it did. I wasn't prepared for I guess, first of all, the sheer uselessness of the prison system. And it really, if you haven't been in a prison, or as someone who works there, or as a prisoner, it's hard to imagine how badly organized our prisons are. Everything happens on pieces of paper. There are physical forms which you have to submit for things. They get lost. Nothing ever really happens when it's supposed to. Organizationally, they are disastrous, and morally, they're disastrous as well. And that's the other thing, I think, which isn't very well understood. So people talk quite a bit now about prisons not being well funded, not having enough staff, and not having enough resource. And those things are true. There are crumbling buildings with bad wiring and often intermittent water supply, and there's rats and cockroaches, all of that sort of stuff. That people can kind of understand that. Those material conditions are, I think, quite comprehensible. But they're not the worst thing about prisons. It's the moral rot, which I think is the worst and most insidious thing.
What does that moral rot look like? Is it amongst? I mean, clearly it's going to exist amongst the inmate population, and we can perhaps get to that a little bit later. But in what way does the moral rot exist within the population of prison workers, employees?
You're absolutely hitting the nail on the head there. So of course, prison is lawless because it's full of people who've broken the law, but it's also lawless because it's staffed by people who don't really often care about the law and about rules. So for example, prison is full of lots and lots of rules about lots of different things. And I assumed before I went there that those would be enforced. It sort of makes sense because people who've been sent to prison, including me, are normally sent there because we've broken society's rules. We've done something wrong. And therefore, one would assume we need to put those people in a prison system which teaches them that the rules are important, they should be upheld, they are objective moral standards of behavior. And instead, you have loads of rules that just get ignored or used in a sort of weaponized way. So, for example, vaping. So when I was at Wandsworth, as in most prisons, vaping is banned apart from if you're in your cell. That's in theory the rule. In reality, that rule is almost never enforced. So you would see staff and prisoners vaping on the landings. And I remember once seeing a new officer. They looked had a very fresh face look that a new trained officer has, come onto the landing, and they told a prisoner who was vaping to stop vaping, and everyone laughed at them, including some of their colleagues were laughing at the idea. And that might seem like a very silly, very minor thing, but actually it's very emblematic. If you imagine you're someone who's just arrived in that job and you are instantly realizing that the rules don't matter, no one takes this seriously, everything I've been told in training is just a joke. Same thing happens with drugs. So cannabis has a very strong smell, as I'm sure everyone knows, and spice, the synthetic cannabis, which is smoked in prisons a lot, also has a very strong and very distinctive smell. So officers will often be walking past a cell and it'll be very, very obvious that someone in there is smoking, and they will do nothing about it. There's just a lack of willingness to confront rule breaking. Those sorts of small scale things contribute to a culture of moral slackness. And then there's bigger stuff as well. There's the sort of tacit acceptance of drug taking is hugely harmful, but you also get some prison staff, officers and other civilian staff in the prison, contributing to the flow of drugs into prisons, the flow of contraband, bringing in iPhones to sell, bringing in tobacco. It's disastrous because it undermines any kind of reasonable sense of good order, and there's really no sort of justice displayed by the system. It doesn't confront bad behavior and challenge it. It just allows it a lot of the time. And you see as well that prisoners who kick up a fuss and shout and smash up their cell are often placated and so effectively rewarded. I'll never forget this. This thing that happened at Wandsworth. There was a chap who had just arrived in the jail, and he was about 40, and he was a vegan. And the reason I know he was a vegan is because he had vegan tattooed on his neck. And he was put in a cell with an older man who wasn't a vegan. And on their first night, they were both eating their food in their cell, because that's where you eat. And the vegan said to the other guy, you're not eating that in here. I'm a vegan. I don't want to smell your meat. And the older guy said, look, I'm going to eat what I want to eat. And a fight broke out, which resulted in the vegan beating the older guy up so badly that he was hospitalized. There was no prosecution, no investigation by the police, no punishment for the vegan for doing this. He was, in fact, effectively rewarded because the prison then at that point decided he was a threat to other prisoners. So they popped him in a single cell. So he now had exactly the same space, but didn't have to share it with someone else. A little bit later, he got a job in the gardens. And because, again, he was a threat to other people, he was given what was generally agreed to be the best job in the gardens. And this was a job where he was on his own, so he couldn't be a risk to other prisoners, and he could just walk around all day doing gardening around the whole site. So the functional effect of that is that his act of violence received no punishment and actually a number of rewards. And you see that pattern repeated again and again in the system. It actually rewards, rewards bad behavior. And on top of that, we have a layer of kind of criminology thinking, which has infested a lot of the prison system, which I think is very concerned with finding the reasons that someone might be in prison, and not very interested in their agency. And I should say there are lots of people in prison who've had horrendous lives, and I feel a deep and overwhelming sadness and empathy for so many of them, because actually they've had horrendous lives. I think a quarter of prisoners have been in care at some point. The rates at which people who've been in prison were abused, either physically or sexually, or both, as children, are astonishingly high. So there are a lot of people in prison who have been deeply harmed through their lives, particularly in their early years. And we shouldn't lose compassion for that. But also, I believe the only way we can actually help people to change their lives is to get them to recognize that they have agency. If you just tell someone all the time that, it's not your fault, you can't do anything about it, that's very disempowering. And if you layer that on top of a culture which actually rewards bad behavior, there's no incentive to change. So that's when I talk about the moral rot, and I think that's particularly insidious, because you could have all the funding and all the new buildings that you wanted, but the system would still be morally corrupt.
Well, I think it's probably too much to say, how is it that we move towards a vision for, I suppose, society-wide here in Britain, where we effectively repair the moral rot towards something where you actually have objective values of morality and truth, a kind of a cultivation of character, habituating virtue, proper discipline, zero tolerance in places where you need zero tolerance. Because I suppose all of this is downstream of a kind of moral relativism that is, I suppose, instantiated into all of us now, post-cultural revolution of the 1960s, a kind of vague universalism. And also we've got a hedonistic streak in society, which I think has come to infect just about everyone of every class. And then on top of that, we're post-literate and all the rest of it. And so I think we're generally unable to make moral decisions very well. And I dare say that people who are prison officers today and prison guards and wardens or whatever else they're called are so far removed from what you would have seen pre that cultural revolution of 1960s. Would you have had female prison guards sleeping with prisoners? Would you have found yourself in a position where you're doling out some of the privileges that you've outlined to some of the most dangerous or badly behaved, just for the sake of an easy life, even though in the end you make a harder life because those prisoners go on to harm other people and harm prison officers and all the rest of it. So maybe we can get into that, David, which is, I suppose, one very famous prisoner, or an infamous prisoner right now in this country, is the Southport killer, Axel Radicabana, who, as we all know, massacred 3 girls and many others were close to losing their lives in Southport at a Taylor Swift dance class. And he ended up in the prison system. And not long after he was locked up, he was then able to acquire some hot cooking oil, which he then threw from the first or second floor of a prison onto some prison guards below. How does something like that even come about?
Yeah, I think if you haven't been in prison or haven't worked in a prison, you would read that headline and just ask that question: how could that ever happen? So there's a few things. We have broadly speaking, a legal and policy culture in prisons, which says that we pretty much have to treat all prisoners pretty much the same. So we don't, generally speaking, take away what are seen as basic privilege, basic entitlements from prisoners, unless they are, for a short period of time locked up in a segregation because they've done something egregious, for example. So what that means is, clearly in this case, Radicabana would have had in his cell a kettle, like almost every cell in prisons in Britain has, and this is for making a tea and that sort of thing. And as I understand it, he had collected, so it wasn't a vat of cooking oil he got. What he'd got was their little sort of single-use packs of vegetable oil spread that they give you in prison. He had collected lots of them, melted them in his kettle, used the kettle to get it really hot, and thrown that. Right. So none of that should happen. And I think one of the challenges is that, yes, we've lost an objective sense of morality, and I think you're absolutely right. I think you're perhaps referencing Nicomachean ethics when you talked about this idea that virtue is a habit, which I do very firmly believe. But I think there's also, we've created a society, and this isn't just in prison, but we've created a society where we're so bound by these rules that we've written that we treat them as if they're geography, when they're actually just a choice. And we see it clearly. The week we're recording this, the government's been trying to deport people to France, and has been told in one case that it can't yet with one chap because he said that he was once trafficked, and therefore our modern slavery act says that we can't deport him because he'd be a victim. So we have these strange rules we've created which produce incredibly perverse outcomes, and yet we act as if we're bound by them, and I think that's probably. And so with someone like Radicabana, I attended his sentencing by video link, and some of I think anyone who went to some of the details which were described in the court, I don't think anyone reported, because the stuff that's been reported is horrific enough, but some of the other details were just, I don't think anyone needs to hear them. And having listened to that, I think you can't really conclude anything other than that there's no point. Radicabana is never going to be rehabilitated. He's always going to be a threat. And he has committed an appalling set of sadistic killings in a really, really calculated and brutal way. So the idea that he should be treated even in the same way as what I would call an ordinary murderer, I think is a nonsense. So most murderers, and I did come to know quite a few murderers at the second prison I was at because they were coming up to release. Most murderers are not monsters like Radicabana or like Wayne Couzens or the serial killers of TV and film. They are usually young men who get involved in a territorial or status dispute with another young man, or it's one gang versus another gang, and that escalates to violence and someone dies. And I'm not trying to minimize the horror of taking a life like that, but it's far more, I think, morally comprehensible. I think most of us can understand that young men might fight, young men have fought one another forever, and that's a more normal thing. but there's clearly a very different moral character to a killing like the killings perpetrated by Rudy Cabana, or the horrendous crime of Wayne Couzens. So I think we are crazy to think we could treat someone like Rudy Cabana like another prisoner. He's never going to be released. He's got no incentive to change. So, and this is, often one of the arguments that's presented against the death penalty is that we can keep prisoners locked away and keep the world safe from them, so we don't need to execute people. Well, that's only true if you choose to believe that the people who work in prisons aren't human beings and aren't deserving of safety. And Rudy Cabana will very clearly keep trying. We also had Hashim Abedi's brother, didn't we? Azra Hashim Abedi this year trying to kill prison staff.
This is the brother of the Manchester Evening News Arena bomber at the Ariana Grande concert. Exactly,
yeah. So he's, I think he's another one who's serving a very, very long but not whole life tariff. But these are young men who hate everything about our civilization and our people. Of course, they're going to keep trying to kill in prison, and they won't target the other prisoners who they feel an affinity with. They'll target the staff. So what are we really trying to do in locking someone like that up for 50 or 60 years until they eventually die of old age? I just don't really think there's a point. And I think it's a choice which actually causes harm to the people who work in prisons, and that's not fair or right.
Well, we're around the death penalty conversation. I think what has been interesting, given that I think the only discussion we might have ever really been exposed to on death penalties, particularly for yours and my generation, is when we went to school and you might have been in religious education or something, and there would be some sort of a philosophical discussion about whether we should have the death penalty or not. Or that, in fact, it wasn't usually about whether we should or not. It was just there was once a death penalty, but due to progress, we got rid of it because we're a more compassionate society. What I think has been quite interesting is that the notion of bringing back the death penalty, which pretty much always remained quite popular with large parts of the population, is now gaining credibility through journalists here in the United Kingdom, Peter Hitchens being a long-time advocate for bringing it back, because he lays out the case that England and Britain has become a much more crime-ridden society since it got rid of it, because it was such a strong disincentive to go and commit horrifying crimes. So that was his argument. The argument being put forward by probably the right's favourite political influencer, but an actual politician, Nayib Bukele, the El Salvador president, he actually puts forward a Christian case for the death penalty, which is, look, I believe that there is a God and that ultimately we all have to answer to our creator whenever we leave this earth, and that's up to his judgment. However, we need to make sure that we deal with injustice here on earth. So people who have committed these crimes, they need to go because they are beyond the pale, and it's up to us to be able to try and create the best society we can, because if we don't, it goes to rack and ruin. And he points to his own country's recent history to suggest that our non-judgmentalism, our lack of ability to actually use power in such a way to root out all of this criminality, is only going to make life worse for everyone else. And that has to surely be going against what it means to be a just and Christian ruler. So I'm clearly picking up from you that actually we need to learn a kind of discernment between those who might actually be able to be rehabilitated and those who aren't, and actually maybe the death penalty is worthwhile bringing back in those instances. So you can put me right if I've gotten that wrong. Where do you think the death penalty conversation might go? Because if we think about where, I don't know, even the idea about immigration being reduced and mass deportations and all the rest of it, that swung so rapidly in one direction, a seemingly unstoppable trajectory, that I think it seems like potentially we could see death penalty being clamoured for more and more by an ever restless population who are really annoyed, fearful of the rampant criminality within this country. What do you think? Do you think there's going to be an appetite for it? And do you agree with the idea of bringing it back?
Yes, I am a Christian, and I am a Christian who has now come to conclude that the death penalty is necessary, and I think is a part of being a civilized country. So how have I got there? I think you're absolutely right. Sort of, 20 years ago, I think I, like most of my generation, was kind of reflexively anti the death penalty. The state killing people is not a thing to be taken lightly. It's never a small thing to take a life. I think we built a society which didn't need the death penalty in the West, in Western Europe. And how do we do that? There's an argument, of course, that we essentially pacified Western Europe by, if you look at some of the medieval era stats, we were maybe executing 1% of the male population in some areas every year. So, and possibly executing out of the gene pool all of the most violent men. I think the issue is that there are some crimes which we can't forgive on earth, and I think in many cases the very Christian thing to do is to, offer the condemned man a priest, pray for his soul, and execute him. And that is the compassion doesn't mean being weak, and I think that's where people get it wrong. I can feel a deep compassion for someone and also recognize that it is not fair to the weak and the vulnerable in our society that person continues to inhabit it. And those are, I believe, perfectly compatible positions. I think the hard thing is, where do you draw the line? So, for example, I think a Wayne Couzens or an Axel Rudikabana or a Hashim Abedi, they should be hanged within a couple of weeks of conviction and sentence. There's just no point messing around with that. At the other end of so one of the problems here is how we classify murder in this country. We don't have, in some jurisdictions like the US, you have sort of murder 1, murder 2. We don't have that distinction. So we just have murder. You do get a distinction in sentencing in terms of what the kind of crime is. But at the other end of the murder spectrum, that way, you have the way that joint enterprise law has been used. So in theory, joint enterprise should mean that if you and I go to confront someone and we go to attack him, and I happen to be the person who gets the gun out and pulls the trigger, but you're there beside me, we're both guilty of that murder. And I think there's a moral sense to that, which most people would agree with. The way it's used now, though, is it tends to scoop up, men who've been in the same WhatsApp group, men who were in a Uber together earlier that day, and one of them, this one case over, one guy left the group saying he didn't want to be involved, and they went on to kill someone, and he's still, prosecuted for murder and convicted. So I think there are some issues at that end that we would need to think about. Where do we draw the lines, and what specific crimes warrant the death penalty? I think another space that I would use it, though, actually, this comes back to not having to treat everyone the same. We have this, again, we've all told this at school, you've got to treat everyone the same, but actually, why? I don't think there is a moral obligation to treat everyone the same. And one area I would draw a distinction is if someone is a guest in this country and they commit a crime, we should treat that more harshly. So I would be, I think the violation of, if we think about that, there've been stories, of course, in the news in the last few months about people who arrived here, claimed asylum, and then committed sexual assaults and rapes on women and girls. So the violation there of personhood, of hospitality, and of trust, I think is so egregious that those are the sort of crimes that I would also, I think would be suitable for the death penalty. And again, there's a very powerful deterrent effect there. And I think we, particularly when we are dealing with people coming from parts of the world which are more, violent in lots of ways, and which haven't gone through the sort of pacification process, shall we say, that Western Europe did, we need to send clear messages. I think people do confuse kindness for softness. And actually, in reality, we have been pretty soft as a society, and we need to stop being soft if we are to survive.
Yes, and that kindness, which is softness masquerading as kindness, has led to a deep unkindness to the people of the country having to suffer. Indignities would be a very light way of putting it. And yes, what you just outlined there, I think, would be just as much of a deterrent for those seeking to come here to take advantage of welfare system and all the rest of it, as would an offshore detention centre. Yes, also, I think what's interesting is I think people think that because the Christian story is that of love, and that it is we welcome all and we meet you where you're at, is that it gets boiled down to that and that alone. Whereas you can find any number of messages within the Gospels. I think it might even be in the book of Matthew, where Jesus cautions people to watch out for the wolves in sheep's clothing and that they must be dealt with. So there was another side even to Christ, the God man, and he wasn't all just sweetness and light, which is ultimately what we boiled that down to, and then turned into a secular humanism, which seeks to just be kind.
And it's the it is the morality of the nursery, right? It's probably a great way to manage a bunch of kids, sort of 5-year-old kids running around throwing things at each other. Just be kind to everyone. But it's no way to run a society or to think about how we as a nation should interact with the rest of the world. It's profoundly ill-suited to that.
Earlier, when you were talking about Abedi and Rudy Cabana, you referenced that there are these men who hate our civilization, and they will keep on doing what they can to subvert it and attack members of it. Abedi, we know, was from a very radically Islamic family, and there has been much speculation about Rudy Cabana and his Islamic faith, or not. We had been told not.
Well, I know that he has been seeing imams in prison. So I believe that he certainly is a practicing Muslim now.
Yeah. I think there's a bit of news that came out in the last couple of days that he had a poster of Jihadi John, one of the ISIS figures, on his wall at home.
Yeah, I think so obviously the inquiry is ongoing. I think that will throw up a lot of this. I suspect there will be some interesting details about his family generally as well. I think it's probably fair to say that I mentioned before, people who end up in prison, people who do terrible things, have often had terrible things done to them. And that, I say it not to excuse, but to perhaps understand. Like, I would be surprised if there wasn't some kind of, difficult familial environment in one way or another. And I'm sure the inquiry will tease that out. But it's not really our problem, or it doesn't have to be our problem.
No,
it's very sad that bad things happen to people, but it doesn't mean we therefore have an obligation to let them hurt and destroy us.
No, not at all. And resting on that topic of civilizational enmity for a while, there's been much documentation of there being quite rampant Islamic gangs within the prison system. I think Tommy Robinson has spoken about this quite frequently, which is to say that there's a culture of intimidation and forced conversions, and people realizing that if they're going to get by in prison, they had better enjoy the privileges of being part of the Islamic community. How much of this is real? Is it a big problem? Did you see any evidence of it yourself?
Yes, it's a huge issue. I think if anyone's interested in this, it's good to go and read the Jonathan Hall KC report, which he published a few years ago. He was the government's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, and now I think he's the He's doing something else, security and terrorism related for the state. His report on the approach and the issues around Islamic gangs and Islamic extremism in prison is genuinely terrifying reading. And he talks actually also about this culture of turning a blind eye, which we opened this conversation with, and how there's a sort of uncomfortableness about confronting displays of obviously radicalizing Islamic behavior. There's a tendency just to let the Muslim prisoners sort of manage themselves, resolve disputes among themselves, and it's absolutely terrifying reading. And it is very, very clear. It's written by a very sensible, sober, experienced man, and it's brutal in its findings. I don't think there's any reason to believe it's got any better since then. And indeed, over the last few years, order and control have collapsed in our prisons, and as a result, it's no doubt worse. I know over the Easter period, when there were these attacks at Franklin and some instances of other jails, there was concern within the Ministry of Justice that this might be a precursor to widespread Islamist attacks across the prison system, and they were very concerned about whether they would have the capacity to handle that. If you have like one or two riots in a part of the country, you might just be able to cope with it in terms of the deployable specialist squads, but if it was more sustained and more widespread, they were very concerned about what they'd be able to do. So I think there is there's another huge area of state failure, and people, I think, sort of know there's a problem, but no one really seems to want to grapple with it, because the solutions that will actually work take us into that uncomfortable space for liberals, where we're not treating everyone the same, where we're not being kind, we're not being nice, it's not very fair. And I don't think a liberal in the broadest sense government, a Whiggish society government, can confront this stuff, because it's not able to do the tough, hard things that the Bukele's of this world recognize have to be done if we want to have a civilization.
And is that effectively what would be needed to break these gangs up and diminish their influence? Would be to go full Bukele on it? It's going to be isolation, stripping away from their group, not allowing them to communicate with one another, stripping privileges, all of those kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at the attack at Franklin, I understand what seems to have happened there is that they had on this particular wing a whole bunch of very dangerous Islamic terrorist prisoners, and what seems to have happened is that a group of them went off to the gym, and therefore they had staff escorting them, so there were not many staff left on the wing when the attack happened, and there was certainly a suspicion amongst prison staff that was a deliberate choice in order to pull away covers to make the attack happen. So they will collude, and of course these people they hate our civilization. They've made that very clear. That's why they're in prison. And why would we allow them to collude and to plot and to give them access to resources, in order to continue this stuff? I mean, it's suicidal.
What do you think the carrots and the sticks are that are required to achieve prison reform? And let's forget the culture we're currently in, this hyperliberal, non-judgmental, morally relativistic culture. Let's just say, David Shipley, you've been handed the keys to power. What are the things that we should do to incentivize good behavior and rehabilitation in a prison? And what is it that we need to do to wield power in such a way to bring about justice by deterring bad behavior, bad conduct, evil?
Well, I'm writing a book about this. This is I suppose what the conclusion will be. So I'm still thinking this through. But what I think at the moment we need to do is it has to start by enforcing a culture of following the rules and being morally upstanding amongst prison staff. So that means that incidents of prison officer and prison governor corruption must be treated with absolute seriousness. And there are examples where that hasn't been the case. This summer, I published a piece in the Sunday Times, which I worked on with Gabriel Pogren, the Whitehall editor, for many months, where we sort of revealed the story of a prison governor who was the head of security at Wandsworth and was inappropriately directing prisoners being sent to open prisons, to the lowest security prisons, was receiving, it appeared, free landscaping work from a building and garden company owned and operated by organized criminals, and also had communicated with someone who was an associate of those organized criminals who was within Wandsworth prison at the time as an inmate. And when this was unearthed, initially the prison service let him retire on medical grounds with a payoff, because the stress of being investigated, I laugh, it's so ridiculous. It was the stress of being investigated for this stuff by the prison service had made him unwell. He didn't feel he could carry on working. So they let him initially retire on medical grounds. Eventually that was overturned. They clawed the money back, but it doesn't appear that at any point he was referred to the police or there's been any kind of serious effort to identify how this happened. This guy, had been nominated for a Prison Officer of the Year award before. He had connections all throughout the prison service, including quite senior people. So there's this culture, that's an example where it just gets covered up. We just kind of, this sort of tendency to brush things under the carpet and try to ignore them. So I think step one is actually creating a sort of Elliot Ness untouchable style squad, which would go through the prison service everywhere. And I don't just mean in their prisons, but also within head office, and look for every and any hint of corruption and root it out. And that would include, using NCA type powers to go through bank accounts to sort of identify where there might be indicators of corruption, people receiving the strange payments, people going on holidays. It's unclear how they could afford this sort of thing, maybe looking at the house, the sort of houses that people live in. There are certainly, instances, I would say, where people seem to live in surprisingly expensive houses for one or two civil servant salaries. So a lot of this stuff needs to be looked into. So that's step one. You're actually going to fix the organization. Then there's got to be a return to real discipline. And actually, we talk about Bukele, or we talk about sometimes on the kind of the prison reform side thing, people talk about getting to something like a Nordic model and something. We actually have a really good example of what works here in the UK, and it's a place called MCTC Colchester. So this is the military prison. So the military provosts run this. And if you're an officer in the military and you go to prison, you go to normal prison. But if you're in the ranks, you go to Colchester. And Colchester has something like a 9% reoffending rate, compared to about 40%, depending on how you measure it, for the rest of the prison system. And what's even more impressive is that the chance of you reoffending if you go to Colchester is so low that you're actually more likely to commit a crime if you leave the army just normally, having not gone to prison. So it obviously works. And what they do is it's very tough, it's very personalized, and it's really demanding and really giving. So what that means in practice is if you arrive and you've got 4 years to serve at Colchester, their first step will be to sit down and say, okay, John, why are you here? What's actually gone wrong in your life that you're here? And they will figure out, what the specific mix of, you might have substance abuse issues, you might have gambling issues, you might have some, therapy needs to sort of work through some childhood trauma. You might need to get skills and training so that you're more employable when you're released. There'll be a whole set of things. And every day you will get up and you will do a chunk of physical training, and you will work on this program day in, day out in a very demanding way. Everyone has to participate. There's no messing around. There's no lazing on your bunk for 22 hours a day, which is what most of our prisoners do most days, right? That's the thing. Our system, we spend a huge amount of money not really doing anything, not really being particularly punishing or particularly rehabilitating or particularly good at protecting the public. So I would look to move to something like the Colchester model, where there's absolutely no tolerance of drug taking or a violence or a misconduct or refusing to obey orders. It's all very, very, very disciplined, very robust, but actually also really focused on, in the cases where people have the potential and the desire to rehabilitate, helping them rehabilitate. And that's, I think, again, this is sort of idea that we try to treat all prisoners pretty much the same. But I think, as we discussed, there are people who we should just execute. There is no value to anyone, and there is only harm in keeping them alive. There are then people who actually may take 20 years to work through things, and might, maybe one day they'll be able to be safe to go back to society, but it could take a really long time. There are, people who have substantial mental health issues, which, who we should be putting in mental health environments, not in prison. So we have another problem around that. So I think it's about looking at everyone who goes to prison as an individual, and then demanding and offering a very great deal. And that has to be an environment where bad behavior is never rewarded, where there is always discipline. You mentioned before we started recording, you've got a puppy at the moment. So you're obviously going through this, if we've got a puppy or a small child, we can't just placate them every time they display a bad behavior, because we obviously incentivize that behavior. And I think that we need a system which recognizes that, and again, just brings in moral purpose, clear values. I think, a system that's fundamentally more Christian, a system that recognizes that we can love and be compassionate, and also do what is just and right. And so that I think is the sort of system I would seek to move to.
Well, it certainly sounds more humane, both to the prisoners who have a chance of actually being rehabilitated and shown that finally there is some interest in their lives and their development. That's that compassionate part of the Christian governing story, I suppose. And whilst at the same time, the rod of justice being wielded against those who are beyond the pale, beyond rehabilitation, likely to cause more harm and injury, and a ruler should be able to discern between right, wrong, where effort should be put in and effort should not be put in. So I will certainly be keeping my eyes peeled for your book whenever it's ready. We didn't touch on this, mainly because I moved away from it, because I thought it sounds like prison officers and guards are generally just filling their boots with all the things they shouldn't be. But what's the morale like in the prison service? I mean, obviously, I don't want to insinuate that everyone is corrupt and fiddling the books and all the rest of it. But presumably, there are quite a number of people who are not particularly happy with the run of things. What does morale look and feel like?
So I would say, and I should say, that absolutely all prison staff are not corrupt. There is a problem with corruption in the prison service, and there is a cultural failure to root it out. And I think a lot of that is about a fear of the truth. I think there's there's probably lots of career downside. I know of cases where there's been career downside for prison service managers who've really tried to go after corruption, and I think that's part of the problem. But there are lots of people join the prison service for really good reasons. There are people. It's a hard job. It's a dangerous job. It's a thankless job. It's a pretty mentally damaging job as well. If you look at the rates of mental ill health and suicide amongst current and former prison officers, it's a tough job. So there are lots of decent people, but if you are a decent person, the problem is that culturally, if you're a decent person and you go into an organization which is morally corrupt and doesn't care about the rules, it's very, very hard to continue. So I think that it is deleterious to morale, quite obviously, because it's and you speak to, and I speak to prison officers quite often, current and former ones, and the culture and the lack of support from prison managers, from prison governors, from leadership is really, really toxic, and they really feel that. I went to the Prison Officers Association annual conference, the union for prison officers, for the rank and file prison officers. I went there earlier this year, and there was an attack on a prison officer while we were at the conference. And something they've been asking for years and years and years, like over a decade now, is stab vests. And the stab vests were fine. And there's been so much resistance because basically a lot of civil servants in a Ministry of Justice don't like the idea that prison will become militarized, or it'll feel too confrontational. And I think that they think that shows of force are inherently violence generating. And I don't believe that's true. I think there's so you've got a management culture where they don't want to hand out stab vests, and they finally were bullied into accepting it and approving them by Shaban Mahmood, the Lord Chancellor at the time. And despite approving it, this was back in the summer, it was approved. I understand they still haven't actually issued any stab vests. So it's sort of, it can't take that long to I'm sure you can, obviously the government, you could just go on Amazon and order, 20,000 stab vests if you really wanted to. It can't be that difficult. And I think there's a real resistance to some of this stuff. And, maybe they'll try and raise the issue again and challenge it now, because maybe they think David Lammy won't push it in the same way. We'll see. But, if you imagine you work for an employer that generally in its policies seems more concerned with the safety of dangerous men who might want to stab you than you, that's not going to be great for morale. Pay isn't great. One of the other big issues is the Tories gutted the prison service by essentially driving the early retirement of a lot of experienced prison officers back in the back end of last decade. And the result of that is you've kind of lost a lot of what you might call the senior NCOs in army terms. So the average experience of a prison officer now is really low. If you go back 10 years, I think over 2/3 have been in the job more than 10 years. Now, I think it's something like 2/3 have been in the job less than 3 years. It's around that, and so there's an incredible lack of experience, which obviously makes things tougher as well. Because if you're in that kind of job, what you really want to happen is for the new officer to work with an experienced officer who's been in the job 10, 15, 20 years, who knows how to deal with things, has that kind of jailcraft, and that doesn't happen a lot now. You've often got people who've been in the job a year or 18 months mentoring someone who's just arrived, and that is really bad for morale. So yeah, it's bad, and I think why would we expect it to be good? It's a very badly led organization which spends a lot of time and energy at head office and seems unable to manage the basics. Again and again, we see these urgent notifications coming out to the prison inspectorate. Some prisons can't even keep track of prisoners. That was common when I was at Wandsworth. Pentonville had a report about that earlier this year. They release people early, they release people late. It is laughable. I mean, but it's ridiculous as a prison that knowing where the prisoners are, who's in which cell, and calculating how long they're supposed to be there is sort of job one of a prison. And they just, in many cases, that doesn't happen. There are dozens, at least, sometimes hundreds of releases in error every year. It's just astonishing. Some prisons release the wrong person. You might have 2 John Smiths or 2 Mohammed Khans or something, and they have been known to release the wrong one.
Well, there is much to be done, David, and I'm very glad that there is at least one person, and I know there are a few more, who have put some serious thought to this. And as we can see, when people start to push the envelope on a particular topic through the mass communication media that we have now, particularly if people are spotting that it's in response to a rotting public realm, it can get a wind behind it, a prevailing wind. So fingers crossed your book, Lawless, when it comes out, is at the vanguard of that. Before I let you go and let you plug your upcoming book and where people might be able to find you, David, the question I ask all of my guests is what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life that perhaps it was an absolute that you had as a vision of how to act and operate in the world? Maybe it was something of a more day-to-day concern, but what was it that made you think differently?
Lots of things. Really good question. I think the most important one, though, is that in 2017 I came to faith, to Christianity. I suppose I had been an agnostic my whole life. Obviously raised in a culturally Christian environment, and on Christmas Day 2017, I had this overwhelming and profound conversion experience, and ever since I often say I don't really I have faith. I just know it's true, and yeah, like knowing that God is real, that Christ is real, that He died and he came back is I suppose the turning point of my whole life. I think before prison, I think I was morally a mess, and I'd done lots of very in terms of my kind of like conduct in my personal life, in my and in business, I just wasn't in the habit of virtue. I was in the habit of vice, and I think faith, and actually oddly going to prison, gave me a lot of time to think and reflect. And yeah, I think for me that's the turning point, and it sort of gives me I was talking with someone last night actually, and I'm quite positive about the future. I think we are going to win these great battles for our civilization. I think we're going to get to be old men resting under apple trees and knowing that England is safe. And it's going to be hard, but we are going to win. And she was saying that she was more worried about things, and she said, "I think maybe it's because you believe in God." And I said, "Yeah, I do. I think God wants us to live in a just, safe Christian society, and I think He is on our side as well. So I do feel that we are going to win. So I think that coming to Christianity, coming to God, is for me the most important thing I've changed my mind about in my life."
Well, it's fascinating to meet another person who has come to faith in that way. George Owers, who I spoke to recently, also gave not the same answer, but shared his conversion story, and it's something that I myself have experienced.
Amazing!
In 2021, actually, it was a long, slow. Actually, it probably wasn't a long, slow process. I think it actually cascaded rather quickly before then these conversion experiences started to happen, and it became unmistakable what was going on. But I was effectively godless.
He's very loud, isn't he? When he decides it's time, you're like, well, I don't really have a choice about this.
And it was an immediate transformation within my mind. But one thing that actually I've struggled with is, so let's think about what you just said there about the hope for the future. I also share that hope for the future. I believe that England can be saved, and that will be old men sitting under apple trees and all the rest of it. But I tell you the one thing that I've struggled with, and I don't want to shoehorn his name into it, and I'm doing it for purely good reasons, but Charlie Kirk's assassination. Here's a man who was not afraid to say what he thought, to speak the truth, to act justly in the face of his enemies, and to take whatever came his way. And in the end, that was death. And whilst I have a podcast and I speak openly on it, I certainly know there's probably a lot more I could do to stand up and look in the eyes of those people that I disagree with, and to effectively try to understand whether people can see the error of those ways. Some of those errors we've talked about today, right? That non-judgmentalism, the moral relativism, the kind of blind hope that things will just turn out okay in the end without actually working for it, or a total misunderstanding of human nature. There's so much more I know that I could do on that. And that's the one thing that, despite the Christian faith and God having changed my life, that leaves me with a weighty conscience still, because I go, do you know what? I'm still called forward to try to advance the interests of my country and the people who live here. And anyway, I think what has sprung to mind is, and I think you met him as well, Connor Tomlinson, someone who I've become friends with. We spoke offline before we recorded a show last year, and he talked about, and as a lot of people do, they bring up Tolkien, a great Catholic and Christian writer, and obviously he's famous for Lord of the Rings, and the most unlikely of heroes, the hobbits, which are effectively just an allegorical version of the English people who just want to be living a nice, comfortable life away from the evils of the world. But as Connor said to me, is that in the end, if you want the Shire, you still have to go out to Mordor. You still have to go out and defend it. And that's one thing I'm still trying to fully grapple with, which is I feel like I've got 1 foot in and 1 foot out, but there's so much going on that I'm feeling more and more pushed toward the front line, but I just need to find the courage to face it.
Yeah, and I think it's hard, and we could all always do more. And I think we have to. And there are, I think Charlie's assassination was a horrific thing. But there are worse things than dying. There are many worse things than dying, and we will all die one day. And I think there are two paths here. Either we do everything we can and we get to be old men under apple trees watching our grandchildren play and knowing that England is safe, or we imagine how you would feel as an old man in exile, knowing that your nation is lost and you could have done more. And I think we will win. I really do believe that. But I think it requires us all to step forward as much as we can and to make the arguments in the public sphere, to challenge these evil ideas that are dressed as pieties and dressed as virtue, and to ultimately to advocate, to campaign, to win office and bring about a government that's going to do what is necessary to make England safe again. And I just think we all have to step forward as much as we can. It's getting easier. There are things that I and many other people have written and said publicly in the last year that would have been, career death just 2 years ago. I think that you mentioned the conversations around about remigration, for example. That's the acceptable discourse, and that has transformed in the last 12 to 18 months. And I think the thing is, we do have right and truth on our side, and so our arguments really are fundamentally about interacting with the world and people as they are, and making the best of that. And because we live in the real world, our arguments are powerful, and I think the typical hobbit will rise those ideas, and that is a good thing. And also, we would all like to be hobbits. I think part of me would much rather be, sitting outside a cottage somewhere, writing poems and retellings of Greek myths and stuff like that. But actually, also, I think I do believe we're blessed to have this opportunity to get to actually. If you imagine what it must have been like to be a Christian who was born in 1940, and you would have just watched your whole life the slow hollowing out of the nation, of this kind of rampant atheist materialism and this expanding death cult. And I think we're at the going down of that now, and we're something new is being created. The British state and the British society that currently exists is not going to endure. So we get to help build something new, and I think that's a blessing. And I think we are really lucky to have that opportunity. So we should all rise to it.
Yes, well, they're definitely down with the orcs, up with the hobbits, and that was a quite unexpected but very nourishing, welcome, and enjoyable end to our conversation. So thank you for sharing something so personal and allowing me to do so as well. David, before I let you go, we talked about your book, which is in the process of being written. When can we expect to see that? And where can people find you in the darker corners of the internet if they want to keep up with what you're doing?
Sure. So I'm writing the book at the moment. I think hopefully it'll be out around next September. And it'll be Lawless from Policy Press. I'm at Shipley Writes on Twitter, which is generally the best place to find me. And I have a Substack, which is linked on there, which people can find.
David, thanks so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope to be able to speak to you again and keep fighting the good fight.
Yes, you too. Take care.
All the best. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.